On January 5, 1942, as victory cheers rolled through Tokyo streets, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto ordered his staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to begin planning the war's second stage. His review of dispatches from the Philippines, Malaya, and the southern theaters suggested one thing. Within months, Japanese forces would hold most of East Asia. Yamamoto told his chief of staff, Admiral Matomi Ugaki, bluntly, "Have the plans ready by mid-February." The speed of conquest stunned Tokyo. Yet it also fractured consensus within the Imperial General Staff One camp. The zealots of the military right demanded relentless advance. Press on while victory lasts. The other, the cooler voices around Yamamoto, feared overreach. Yamamoto had been lukewarm about opening war with the United States and Britain. Now he worried about how long early triumphs could be sustained. For reasons of safety and principle, Yamamoto remained at sea aboard his flagship, Yamato. His friends on the general staff feared that his outspoken reservations about an unlimited war could make him a target in Tokyo. Around him, he spoke plainly. In Ugaki's diary, he urged far-sighted statesmanship, a steady long-range view that he believed Japan's politicians sorely lacked 3 months before Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto warned a close ally, Ryoichi Sasakawa, that political decisions had made war almost inevitable. He used a stark image. Japan would spread like an octopus, branching outward, but those tentacles could soon be overstretched. Now, barely a month into hostilities, that metaphor seemed painfully apt. The empire lay vast yet fragile. Yamamoto hoped for a way to convert battlefield success into diplomatic advantage. He believed a major, unmistakable victory might create a window for negotiation, but only briefly. He estimated roughly 18 months of favorable leverage after an initial triumph. Beyond that, the balance would shift. He confided this urgency to Sasakawa, urging him to press the point with right-wing leaders in power. On January 5th, victory looked within reach. Pearl Harbor had shattered the U.S. battleship force. British capital ships, Repulse and Prince of Wales, lay sunk off Malaya. Manila and Cavite were seized. Hong Kong had fallen. Japanese troops were landing across the Dutch East Indies, Rabaul, and the Solomons. Yet a crucial asset remained. The American aircraft carriers had not been destroyed at Pearl Harbor. They loomed as a continuing mobile threat. Yamamoto argued for a spectacular blow, something decisive enough to break American will. The Army rejected his proposal to strike the Soviet Union. Their forces were committed to China and Southeast Asia, and a land war against Russia was beyond their capacity. That left 3 alternatives. His preferred scheme was audacious, an Indian Ocean campaign, drawing out and annihilating the British Eastern Fleet, then pushing into the Middle East to secure oil fields and link with German advances. The Army vetoed that too. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo proposed instead a wide campaign to seize Australia. After moving through the Solomons, take New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, deny the Allies a staging ground. Some at Imperial General Headquarters were already mapping occupation plans for Australia, and New Zealand. Yamamoto rejected this option as too slow and not dramatic enough to force American negotiators. In January then, he ordered another plan drawn up 2 months later. Officers arrived in Tokyo with the MI plan, a blueprint for luring the U.S. carrier force into a decisive engagement near Midway Island, annihilating it. Alongside came the AL plan, seizing the Aleutians, then pressing toward Hawaii and, if fortune smiled, the West Coast. Yamamoto believed that victories at Midway and in the north could create the bargaining table he sought. Tokyo's Navy ministers argued. The debates were fierce. Meanwhile, other operations continued. The fall of Singapore on February 15th, once thought central to Yamamoto's diplomatic timetable, was suddenly less pivotal after the Doolittle raid in April. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25s had reached Tokyo, and the raid pierced Japanese confidence. The psychological impact was enormous. The enemy could strike home. June brought catastrophe at Midway. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were lost. The blow was so severe that the Army did not even grasp its full magnitude. News of the disaster was tightly held within the Navy's highest circles, while Yamamoto tasted defeat. Tokyo's other movements pressed on southward. Rabaul had been secured in late January. Air reconnaissance and strikes targeted islands in New Guinea. Tulagi was occupied. Seaplane bases were built. The Imperial General Staff, still committed to a southern strategy, had ordered a push toward Port Moresby, a thrust they expected to resume after Midway by May. The Battle of the Coral Sea checked the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby. Carrier forces clashed in a new kind of naval war, one fought principally by airplanes, not battleships. The Australians were alarmed. General Douglas MacArthur, upon arriving in Australia in March, warned Canberra and Washington that Tokyo might soon strike southern theaters. He urged urgently for reinforcements, carriers, planes, anything to blunt the coming blow. Yet in Washington, resources were scarce. Admiral Ernest J. King informed General Marshall that, until late June, the Pacific Command would have only 2 operational carriers, while Japan still boasted 10 Nimitz, sensing the Japanese intent, had already advised of a major move, the one that would culminate at Midway. In those months, choices mattered more than ships. Yamamoto sought a single, overwhelming trophy to buy peace. Others sought empire for empire's sake. As strategies collided, MI versus Australia versus the Indian Ocean, the war's course hinged on the outcomes of a few bloody decisive actions. On June's turning point, the Japanese hope for a bargaining chip evaporated plans that promised politicians a platform for negotiation. Victories at Midway and in the northern operations now looked fragile. Admirals argued fiercely around the Navy Ministry's table. Yet when the dust settled, Yamamoto's strategy had prevailed. Lost in the heat of those debates was the real diplomatic value of earlier successes, the fall of Singapore in February, and the looming collapses at Bataan and Corregidor. Either could conceivably have been the leverage Yamamoto sought. But their potential importance receded after one sudden event: the April raid on Tokyo by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle and his squadron of B-25s. The Doolittle raid shocked Japan. It made clear that American resolve had only begun to harden. It revealed to the Japanese people that the enemy would strike the homeland. As a result, the strategic calculus changed. What once looked like a golden window for diplomacy narrowed and then slammed shut. By June, the Midway operation had become a disaster. 4 of Japan's large fleet carriers were lost. The blow was catastrophic, so much so that the Army received only the most limited, censored details. The Navy kept full knowledge confined to its highest circles. Meanwhile, while Yamamoto was away on his Midway venture, the Tokyo Naval Staff continued pushing the Navy and its air units steadily southward, preparing the next thrust designed to isolate Australia. Naval units had seized Rabaul on January 23rd, and from that date onward conducted constant reconnaissance and bombing against surrounding islands, and New Guinea Australian authorities, alarmed, passed urgent reports to General Douglas MacArthur after his arrival in March. Their message was stark. The Japanese were preparing to advance into New Guinea, and if that push succeeded, Northern Australia could be at grave risk. Already in February, Japanese aircraft had bombed Darwin. In March, their landings at Salamaua in New Guinea accelerated the tempo of operations. In May, just before the clash at Midway, a Japanese task force steamed toward Port Moresby, only to be blunted by determined American and Australian resistance during the carrier engagement in the Coral Sea simultaneously. The Japanese occupied Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, erecting a seaplane base that would threaten Allied lines. The Battle of the Coral Sea altered strategic thinking in both Washington and Canberra. It convinced planners that a serious southern campaign was imminent. MacArthur warned the Australian government, "Be prepared for attack," and fast. In response, he cabled General Marshall requesting 2 carriers and 1,000 planes. Washington's reply, however, was constrained by hard reality. Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed Marshall that until late June, the Pacific Command could field only 2 operational carriers, while, on the eve of Midway, Japan still had 10. Still, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had already sounded the alarm. He anticipated the Japanese maneuver that would culminate at Midway. While those carrier forces squared off in the north, Japanese commanders were simultaneously consolidating gains around New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Major General Tomitaro Hori landed the South Seas Force at Salawa, and naval troops occupied Lae, initiating construction of another airbase in support of the Southern Drive. Independently of Yamamoto's carrier operations, the Imperial General Staff had continued to press for the Port Moresby campaign. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake was ordered to advance toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and to be prepared to renew the assault on Port Moresby by July, a timetable that counted on Yamamoto's combined fleet returning from Midway with carrier cover for the southern offensive. Despite the blow at Midway, which was presented to forces in the field as a victory, Imperial General Headquarters did not immediately alter its southern plans. A few days after Midway, Australian intelligence warned MacArthur that Japanese preparations had reached a new pitch. Buoyed by their perceived victory, Tokyo seemed ready to press onward. MacArthur therefore proposed a bold counterstroke, a preemptive Allied assault on New Britain and New Ireland, followed by an amphibious attack on Rabaul, Japan's main naval air hub in the region. He planned to strike with the 2 carriers, the requested air squadrons, and an amphibious division, and, he believed, force the enemy back to Truk. On June 12th, General Marshall forwarded MacArthur's plan to Admiral King, but with modifications. Marshall wanted 3 carriers, not 2, plus 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions to guarantee success. King resisted. He disliked placing MacArthur in direct command of a primarily naval operation, and he feared the carriers would be vulnerable to land-based strikes without sufficient protection, as events would later show at Guadalcanal and elsewhere. These tactical concerns were real and consequential, so a fierce inter-service dispute emerged. Who would command the counteroffensive? The Joint Chiefs of Staff apportioned responsibilities. Phase 1, the initial task of seizing the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and nearby positions, was assigned to Admiral King under Navy Command Guadalcanal. At that point was a nameless point on many strategic charts, yet it would soon prove pivotal. After Phase 1, MacArthur was to assume responsibility and pursue the remaining Japanese forces through the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. King's plan prevailed. The Joint Chiefs recognized that his defensive line running down the Pacific, designed to protect Australia, required fewer resources than MacArthur's more expansive, troop-heavy proposal. Thousands of Allied soldiers trained in New Caledonia. King secured Army Air Force squadrons for the theater, bolstered Samoa and the New Hebrides, and proposed a new base in Tonga. Meanwhile, Admiral Wilson Brown, whose earlier indecision at Wake Island had drawn King's ire, was reassigned to command the newly formed Amphibious Training Command in San Diego there. He and Marine Major General Holland M. Smith were tasked with inventing the doctrine and techniques of island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief planner, advised that the immediate priority must be to hold the southern line while building and training forces for future offensive operations. In short, buy time, train soldiers for amphibious fighting, and stop the Japanese from reaching New Guinea and northern Australia before it was irrevocably too late. The plan for the Pacific counteroffensive was ambitious, a 4-stage strategy designed to roll back Japan's empire island by island. The first stage would involve preparing and training new amphibious forces. The second was to be a combined Allied drive, with U.S., Australian, and New Zealand troops pushing through the Solomon Islands on toward the Bismarck Archipelago and the Admiralty Islands. The third stage would see the capture of the Caroline and Marshall Islands, and the fourth would strike at either the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. Admiral Ernest J. King approved the plan without hesitation. It was exactly the vision he had outlined himself, bold, relentless, and maritime in focus. To lead it, he recalled Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, who had been serving as a naval observer in London, and assigned him command of the New South Pacific area. King also detached Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner from the Navy's Plans Division and ordered him to prepare to lead the forthcoming amphibious operation. All of this planning unfolded even before Japan's attacks on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley departed Washington on May 1st, with instructions to assume command of the South Pacific Force on June 19th. His first stop, however, was Pearl Harbor to report to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, his direct superior. By the time Gormley reached Pearl, the Japanese southern offensive was already in motion. On May 22nd, an Army reconnaissance plane spotted a Japanese photo aircraft taking pictures over Guadalcanal. Army intelligence quickly deduced that the Japanese were planning to construct an airfield there. By June 25th, New intelligence confirmed that the island's central plain had been cleared and burned, tents were visible, and a wharf was under construction at Lunga Point 6. Days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal radioed that airfield construction was imminent, awaiting only the arrival of Japanese engineering battalions, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, Japan's equivalent of America's Seabees. This information was quickly validated by radio intercepts. Nimitz's intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor, which had already cracked parts of the Japanese naval code, intercepted a transmission announcing that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces were expected to arrive at their destination by July 4th. Fleet intelligence officers connected the dots immediately. That same day, Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor, en route to prepare for amphibious landings somewhere in the South Pacific. When Nimitz showed him the decoded report, Turner understood instantly. The next battlefront would be the Solomon Islands. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, New Zealand, boarding his flagship, the USS Macaulay, a converted Grace Line passenger ship once known as the Santa Barbara. His mission: train, organize, and ready an amphibious task force in just 1 month. While Turner scrambled to move ships and men into position, Admiral Gormley flew to Melbourne for a conference with General Douglas MacArthur. Both men were deeply uneasy. Gormley feared the plan was premature. The U.S. Navy had virtually no practical experience with large-scale amphibious warfare. MacArthur, frustrated by limited resources, agreed. The two commanders concluded that air coverage for the landings would be wholly inadequate. Their meeting, held on July 18th, ended with a joint dispatch to Washington urging a delay. But Admiral King's response was swift and firm. Absolutely not. The invasion would go forward as scheduled. King reminded Gormley that he had warned him from the start. It would be a tough mission, and proper tools would not arrive until autumn. Proceed as planned, King ordered. Gormley left Washington already pessimistic about the U.S. readiness for an aggressive move in the South Pacific. That pessimism deepened when his appeals for additional construction battalions and engineering units went unanswered. From its inception, the Guadalcanal invasion plan suffered from critical intelligence failures. Everyone in the Allied chain of command knew an operation was coming, particularly after July 10th, when Nimitz formally issued Gormley's operations orders. Yet Allied intelligence still underestimated Japan's preparedness. The major Japanese airbase at Rabaul posed a deadly threat. Aircraft from there could stop at Guadalcanal to refuel, then strike deep into Australia. Still, the intelligence summary that reached King on July 10th mentioned the Guadalcanal airfield almost in passing, and even placed it on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, however, the airfield was complete. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto issued his orders. The first stage of the next offensive would sail from Rabaul on August 14th. Meanwhile, Gormley, as overall commander, was pleading for reinforcements. More bases, more aircraft, more supply ships. Everywhere he turned, he encountered the same reality. Admiral King had been right. The tools for victory simply weren't there yet. Even the logistics were a mess. Supplies for the invasion were loaded haphazardly onto transports at Oakland. Despite the port having ample facilities to reorganize cargo in order of use, the ships were instead sent to Noumea, where no such equipment existed. King was aware of these difficulties, but there was no time to delay. He understood better than anyone that Japan had to be stopped before it could strike Australia. The invasion date stood firm. By late July 1942, the race was on. More than 17,000 U.S. Marines, the first large American amphibious force of the war, were steaming across the Pacific, bound for a small, obscure island whose name would soon become legendary, Guadalcanal. All of this planning unfolded even before Japan's attacks on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley departed Washington on May 1st, with instructions to assume command of the South Pacific Force on June 19th. His first stop, however, was Pearl Harbor to report to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, his direct superior. By the time Gormley reached Pearl, the Japanese southern offensive was already in motion. On May 22nd, an Army reconnaissance plane spotted a Japanese photo aircraft taking pictures over Guadalcanal. Army intelligence quickly deduced that the Japanese were planning to construct an airfield there. By June 25th, New intelligence confirmed that the island's central plain had been cleared and burned, tents were visible, and a wharf was under construction at Lunga Point 6. Days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal radioed that airfield construction was imminent, awaiting only the arrival of Japanese engineering battalions, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, Japan's equivalent of America's Seabees. This information was quickly validated by radio intercepts. Nimitz's intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor, which had already cracked parts of the Japanese naval code, intercepted a transmission announcing that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces were expected to arrive at their destination by July 4th. Fleet intelligence officers connected the dots immediately. That same day, Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor, en route to prepare for amphibious landings somewhere in the South Pacific. When Nimitz showed him the decoded report, Turner understood instantly. The next battlefront would be the Solomon Islands. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, New Zealand, boarding his flagship, the USS Macaulay, a converted Grace Line passenger ship once known as the Santa Barbara. His mission: train, organize, and ready an amphibious task force in just 1 month. While Turner scrambled to move ships and men into position, Admiral Gormley flew to Melbourne for a conference with General Douglas MacArthur. Both men were deeply uneasy. Gormley feared the plan was premature. The U.S. Navy had virtually no practical experience with large-scale amphibious warfare. MacArthur, frustrated by limited resources, agreed. The two commanders concluded that air coverage for the landings would be wholly inadequate. Their meeting, held on July 18th, ended with a joint dispatch to Washington urging a delay. But Admiral King's response was swift and firm. Absolutely not. The invasion would go forward as scheduled. King reminded Gormley that he had warned him from the start. It would be a tough mission, and proper tools would not arrive until autumn. Proceed as planned, King ordered. Gormley left Washington already pessimistic about the U.S. readiness for an aggressive move in the South Pacific. That pessimism deepened when his appeals for additional construction battalions and engineering units went unanswered. From its inception, the Guadalcanal invasion plan suffered from critical intelligence failures. Everyone in the Allied chain of command knew an operation was coming, particularly after July 10th, when Nimitz formally issued Gormley's operations orders. Yet Allied intelligence still underestimated Japan's preparedness. The major Japanese airbase at Rabaul posed a deadly threat. Aircraft from there could stop at Guadalcanal to refuel, then strike deep into Australia. Still, the intelligence summary that reached King on July 10th mentioned the Guadalcanal airfield almost in passing, and even placed it on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, however, the airfield was complete. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto issued his orders. The first stage of the next offensive would sail from Rabaul on August 14th. Meanwhile, Gormley, as overall commander, was pleading for reinforcements. More bases, more aircraft, more supply ships. Everywhere he turned, he encountered the same reality. Admiral King had been right. The tools for victory simply weren't there yet. Even the logistics were a mess. Supplies for the invasion were loaded haphazardly onto transports at Oakland. Despite the port having ample facilities to reorganize cargo in order of use, the ships were instead sent to Noumea, where no such equipment existed. King was aware of these difficulties, but there was no time to delay. He understood better than anyone that Japan had to be stopped before it could strike Australia. The invasion date stood firm. By late July 1942, the race was on. More than 17,000 U.S. Marines, the first large American amphibious force of the war, were steaming across the Pacific, bound for a small, obscure island whose name would soon become legendary, Guadalcanal. As the Allied invasion fleet assembled across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to Noumea and Samoa, Admiral Robert L. Gormley found himself too overwhelmed to convene a full-staff conference. Still, on July 28th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who would command the Covering Carrier Task Force, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the USS Saratoga. For the first time, the tactical leaders gathered face-to-face to discuss the coming invasion of Guadalcanal. At this meeting, the chain of responsibility was laid out clearly. Admiral Fletcher would protect the landings with his carriers. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner would deliver the 1st Marine Division under Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift to the beaches. Once the island was secure, garrison troops would follow. But the entire operation had been thrown together so quickly that no reserves were available anywhere in the South Pacific. There were simply no more men to spare. The mood aboard the Saratoga was far from optimistic. Fletcher, cautious by nature, opened the session by announcing that his carriers would remain on station only 48 hours after the landings. He insisted the fleet's few remaining carriers could not be risked. Gormley's staff reluctantly agreed. Fletcher, still haunted by the losses at Coral Sea and Midway, believed the entire plan was rushed, reckless, and doomed. Admiral Turner, who possessed a broader grasp of the global situation than anyone else in that cabin, refused to indulge such pessimism. "The decision's been made," he said sharply. "Our job is to carry it out." His rebuke was pointed and earned. Turner knew that Admiral King had been deeply dissatisfied with Fletcher's earlier timidity in battle. After Coral Sea, King had privately urged Admiral Nimitz to evaluate Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz, ever the gentleman, had handled the matter kindly and kept Fletcher in command. But now, on the eve of America's first offensive operation of the war, Fletcher's warning to withdraw in 2 days felt like a poor omen. The Guadalcanal rehearsal began that same day, July 28th, on Coro Island near Fiji, and lasted 3 days. It was a fiasco. Barely 1/3 of the assigned Marines made it ashore, and most of those who did were disorganized and confused once they landed. General Vandegrift called the entire exercise a complete bust. Yet there was no time to fix anything. On July 31st, his men reboarded the transports and set sail for the Solomon Islands. By August 6th, the invasion task force, in 75 ships strong, was closing in on its target. That afternoon, Admiral Fletcher, ever anxious, detached his 26 carrier group ships, pulling them farther out to sea. He would provide air cover as promised, but he intended to keep his carriers well beyond immediate danger. While American intelligence had failed to detect the scale of Japan's Guadalcanal airfield construction, Japanese intelligence was even worse. The Imperial Army was focused entirely on the New Guinea campaign, preparing Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas Force for a renewed assault on Port Moresby. In July 1942, the Japanese landed 2,000 troops near Buna, aiming to build airfields there for future strikes on Australia. During these weeks, Japanese air forces concentrated almost exclusively on New Guinea bombers, and fighters pounded the docks and airfields around Port Moresby daily. Their naval air units were stretched thin supporting the Buna beachhead, leaving little attention for the Solomons. Meanwhile, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's flagship, the battleship Yamato, lay anchored at Hashirajima in Japanese waters. Calmly and methodically, Yamamoto was preparing for expanded air operations over northern Australia. On August 3rd, the naval air groups stationed at Lae were ordered back to Rabaul, where they were to stand by for operations scheduled to begin the following week. Ironically, the same week the Americans planned to strike Guadalcanal. In early August, heavy tropical clouds rolled over the South Pacific. Only a few Japanese reconnaissance planes ventured out, and none spotted the vast American fleet moving stealthily toward its objective. Those few Japanese aviators who did fly from Rabaul that week were stunned to encounter U.S. carrier aircraft near Buen on Bougainville. They had been told that all American carriers were sunk at Midway, so they assumed these were Australian planes from the Owen Stanley campaign. In truth, those aircraft were conducting final training runs for the Guadalcanal invasion. Neither the Imperial High Command nor the field unit suspected anything. After 8 months of relentless victories, it seemed impossible that the Allies could even attempt, let alone succeed in, an amphibious invasion. Had the idea been raised in Tokyo, most officers would have agreed with General MacArthur and Admiral Gormley that such an assault was virtually impossible. And yet, that impossibility was already sailing toward them. The American Expeditionary Force, protected by secrecy and sheer luck, approached Guadalcanal under cover of storm and shadow. On August 4th and 5th, the Armada steamed through squalls, the gray sky masking its movements. Then, at dawn on August 7, 1942, the weather broke. Sunlight spilled across the ocean. At 5:30 a.m., general quarters sounded aboard every ship by 6 a.m. The carriers Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise launched their first wave of strike aircraft. Their assigned targets, Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese had a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo, connected by a narrow causeway. The day before, poor weather had grounded their aircraft. Fletcher's task force had reported a single unidentified plane. No one knew whether it was Japanese or from MacArthur's command. At 6:12 a.m., the bombs began to fall. For the first time in the Pacific War, American Marines were coming ashore, and the Japanese were completely unprepared. The moment the communications center at the Tulagi seaplane base caught sight of the oncoming American assault, a frantic transmission went out, short, sharp, and filled with panic. Enemy heavy bombardment in progress. Within seconds, the message reached the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, Admiral Yamamoto, and even Imperial headquarters in Japan. As dawn broke, the skies finally cleared. Scattered cumulus clouds drifted lazily across the horizon, and under the faint glow of a quarter moon, the first wave of American fighters and bombers roared into action. From the carrier Enterprise, 8 fighters led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer soared toward Guadalcanal, tasked with hitting enemy aircraft, PT boats, supply depots, and troop encampments. But the skies were empty. No Japanese aircraft, no PT boats, no organized resistance. They unleashed heavy machine gun fire on the half-finished airfield at Lunga Point, tearing through wooden huts and scattering debris across the landing strip. Meanwhile, another combat air patrol of 8 fighters circled over the transport fleet from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., providing air cover as the bombers made repeated runs over Tulagi and Lunga Point. Not a single Japanese plane dared to rise. The morning sky belonged entirely to the Americans. From the carriers Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise, bombers swooped down over Gavutu and Tanambogo, where the Japanese had built a seaplane base. The attack was devastating. In a matter of minutes, 9 float planes and 8 4-engine Kawanishi flying boats were burning wrecks. A few Japanese pilots managed to start their engines, but they were blasted out of the air before they could even lift off. By the time the sun rose high, not a single Japanese aircraft remained intact. Carrier-based planes then turned their fury on Tulagi, targeting the beaches that the Marines were about to invade below. On the decks of the transport ships, American troops stood watching the mountainous outline of Guadalcanal, their long-awaited objective. At sunrise, the massive convoy of 75 ships threaded carefully between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, entering Sealark Channel. The roar of naval guns soon shattered the morning calm. Cruisers and destroyers opened up with everything they had, their flashes lighting up the shoreline. Explosions sent oil depots erupting into walls of fire, flames licking hundreds of feet into the air. For 2 full hours, the bombardment raged. Then, at 8 a.m., the landing craft churned toward the beaches east of Lunga Point. The Marines were tense. None of them, nor their officers, had any real experience with amphibious warfare. This was the first American amphibious landing since the Spanish-American War. At 9 a.m., boots hit sand. The first wave of Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, and to their astonishment, no one fired back. The Japanese had abandoned their positions and fled inland. What they found was surreal. Inside hastily abandoned tents, breakfast still steamed on wooden tables. Bowls of rice, cooked plums, and strips of meat left half-eaten chopsticks lay scattered across straw mats, as if dropped in panic. The scene told its own story. The shelling had torn through their camp so fast that the Japanese fled without even looking back, but that eerie calm wouldn't last. On Tulagi, across the narrow strait, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion, along with the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines, met fierce resistance. Roughly 250 Japanese soldiers, veterans of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under Captain Hasek Miyazaki, held their ground with grim determination. Edson's men, the legendary Marine Raiders, were no ordinary troops. Every one of them was a volunteer, trained under brutal near-Spartan conditions. The Raider idea had been inspired by Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, who had fought alongside China's Communist 8th Route Army, learning the art of guerrilla warfare firsthand. Now, those lessons would be tested. The thick jungle of Tulagi, dense with vines, low trees, and razor-sharp bougainvillea thorns, slowed the Marines to a crawl. Edson's plan was to push inland to a long ridge running down the island, and then sweep southward, clearing out Japanese positions as they went. But progress was agonizingly slow. It took them 3 hours to hack through barely 1.5 miles of jungle. Finally reaching the ridgeline, the raiders pushed forward, only to walk straight into the heart of the Japanese defenses. Here among the hillside trenches and camouflaged bunkers, the real battle for Tulagi began. The Japanese defenders, though outnumbered, were ferocious, their discipline unbroken. They had survived the march through the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies, building a reputation as the most fearsome soldiers in Asia. Tokyo had boasted of their invincibility for months, and now, on this small patch of jungle-covered island, that myth would face its first true test. As Edson's men dug in and prepared to fight, they knew one thing: Guadalcanal might have been taken easily, but Tulagi was going to be paid for in blood. The Japanese defenses on Tulagi were built with chilling precision. Deep dugouts, stone-walled embrasures, and machine guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. From the high ground, the Japanese intended to pin down the approaching Marines below, but the raiders quickly adapted. Crawling on their bellies inch by inch, they scaled the cliffs, and when they got close enough, they hurled grenades and dynamite charges directly into the dugouts. That brutal hands-on method became their only path forward. One dugout was blown apart so completely that 17 Japanese soldiers were found dead inside. When a Marine spotted a radio set among the wreckage, he rushed in to retrieve it, only to be gunned down by 2 hidden Japanese still alive inside another Marine, who tried to help met the same fate before both attackers were finally shot. As Edson's men pushed deeper, his center and left flank crept down the ridgeline, while a section of Marines engaged a central strong point that refused to yield. The terrain was punishing. Vines tangled around boots, cliffs were slick with mud, and the casualties mounted fast. By late afternoon, one company had already lost nearly 15% of its men. The frontal resistance was fierce enough, but the snipers were worse. They seemed to be everywhere, lashed high in tree branches, hidden in shattered buildings, crouched behind rocks. Their favorite trick was to wait until the first wave of Marines had passed, then open fire on their backs. It was a suicidal tactic, but they made it count. The Marines soon discovered something else unsettling. The small 6.5mm Japanese rounds rarely killed outright. They maimed, leaving screaming wounded that drained manpower and morale. It was cold efficiency. Every injured Marine pulled 2 more off the line. By late day, the raiders reached a 3-sided ravine, its floor, ironically, an old British cricket field. The Japanese had burrowed into the ravine walls, turning the peaceful green into a kill zone of crossfire. When Edson saw the maze of machine guns waiting ahead, he halted. The advanced darkness was closing in, and the next move would be suicide. That night, the Marines got their first taste of the Japanese counterattack, the kind that would soon become infamous. At around 10:30 p.m., as the jungle quieted, the Japanese struck. Screaming war cries shattered the silence as they burst through a gap between 2 Marine companies. Surrounding one completely, the fighting was savage. Grenades, bayonets, pistols, knives, and fists in the dark. The enemy surged up the ridge, coming within 50 yards of Colonel Edson's command post. When dawn broke, the ridge was littered with bodies. The Marines had driven the Japanese back, but one company had lost half its non-commissioned officers. The next day, August 8th, reinforcements came ashore, swelling the Tulagi force to 7,500 troops. The raiders and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines resumed their advance toward the island's southeastern end, blasting one dugout after another. They came upon the same ravine again, and this time they fought their way down into it, clearing caves one by one. In a single cavern, 35 Japanese corpses lay in twisted heaps, some decomposed, others freshly killed. From this, the Marines realized the truth. The Japanese would fight to the last man, retreating only if ordered. It was a shocking discipline that most Americans had never encountered. The few Japanese who had surrendered on Guadalcanal turned out to be laborers, not soldiers. The real fighters, like those here, would die before surrendering. One haunting scene seared itself into memory. The raiders cornered 3 Japanese officers in a dugout. When the Marines readied their final charge, they heard 3 gunshots from within. Inside, they found all 3 men dead. One had fired his last 3 rounds, killing his comrades before turning the pistol on himself. For the Marines, this suicidal devotion was difficult to comprehend. Wounded men, trapped soldiers, even those hopelessly surrounded, refused to yield. And when a few faked surrender, only to pull hidden pistols or grenades at close range, the lesson was burned in for good. From that point on, no Marine expected mercy, nor offered any. By the evening of August 8th, Tulagi was largely under control, Though scattered Japanese snipers kept firing from trees and caves for days afterward, the stubbornness of the fighting could be summed up in one man's story: Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss. Goss crept ahead of his unit toward a cave that had been spitting fire at them all morning. He pulled the pin from a pineapple grenade, counted to 6, and threw. It landed inside and came flying right back out. He dove for cover as it exploded. Cursing, he tried again. Same result. The enemy hurled it back every time. Snarling, Goss called for a satchel charge, a heavy bag packed with dynamite. He lit the fuse, shoved it into the cave, and sprinted back. The Japanese soldiers kicked it out again just before it detonated, sending a rock splinter deep into his leg. Bleeding and enraged, Goss grabbed his Thompson submachine gun, stormed straight into the smoke-filled cave, and cut down 4 Japanese defenders at point-blank range. That was the kind of battle Tulagi had become. Close, savage, and deeply personal. The battle on WW2 and Tanambogo proved even more brutal than the fierce fighting that had engulfed Tulagi. The landings began late in the morning. Commanders had assumed only a small enemy force was stationed there, so only limited Marine units were sent in. But that assumption turned out dead wrong. These islands housed the Japanese seaplane base, and the defenders had turned every ridge and slope into fortified kill zones. When the first wave of Marines splashed ashore, they faced nothing more than light rifle fire. The Japanese were still disoriented from the earlier naval and aerial bombardment that had wiped out their seaplanes. Yet, by the time the second wave arrived, the Japanese had regrouped about 500 yards inland, and the beach instantly became a storm of machine gun tracers and mortar bursts. By the third wave, the incoming landing craft were hit before they even touched the sand, leaving bodies and wreckage floating in the surf. Both WW2 and Tanambogo were crowned with small, steep hills, barely 150 feet high, but enough to dominate the coastline below. The Japanese had carved their bunkers and firing slits along these slopes, and they were heavily armed with machine guns, automatic rifles, and endless boxes of ammunition. Each defensive nest had to be individually stormed. There was no surrender, no retreat. The fighting on Tanambogo was especially vicious, hand-to-hand and unrelenting. In one early wave, U.S. tanks managed to land, but the Japanese swarmed them in suicidal fury. They jammed crowbars under the treads, hurled grenades, and shoved gasoline-soaked rags into engine vents to set them ablaze. One tank commander opened his hatch and fired the vehicle's machine gun, killing 23 attackers before a Japanese soldier clambered up and drove a bayonet through his chest. Moments later, another Japanese soldier tossed burning rags into the open hatch, and the tank erupted in flames. By mid-afternoon, it was obvious the Marines were badly outnumbered and needed reinforcements. A detachment that had earlier landed on Florida Island, where no Japanese forces were found, was quickly called over. Although Tanambogo was technically captured, the Marines couldn't yet secure the causeway connecting it to WW2. As night approached, the reinforcements received a brief 5-minute naval bombardment as cover. But disaster struck. The last few shells hit a fuel dump near the beach, igniting a massive fireball that lit the shore as bright as noon. Now the advancing Marines stood fully exposed, their silhouettes clearly visible against the fiery glow. From the dugouts on the hillside, Japanese gunners opened up with ruthless precision. 2 landing boats managed to reach the beach, but the coxswain of the third was killed instantly, sending his craft spinning back out to sea. Seeing this, the following boats hesitated, believing some order to withdraw had been given. That left the men from the first 2 boats stranded on the shore with only a concrete pier as shelter. The Japanese zeroed in on their position, tracing muzzle flashes in the dark. Soon, wounded men piled up. One of the boats evacuated the injured, and confusion reigned before fresh landing craft finally re-entered the beach zone. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a ferocious counterattack. Captain Crane, commanding the small beach unit, was cut off with 5 of his men. They hid in dense brush until nightfall and eventually crawled back to safety once the Japanese withdrew to their hillside fortifications. It wasn't until 4 a.m. on August 8th that another Marine unit landed and finally secured the causeway, ending the bloodbath. When the fighting had begun, roughly 500 Japanese troops held the Twin Islands. When the battle was over, none remained alive. Early on August 7th, the Japanese radio station on Tulagi managed to transmit a desperate message to Rabaul, the first alarm that the United States had begun its assault. The shocking report reached Rabaul Airfield just as pilots were prepping for another bombing run over New Guinea. Orders for that mission were instantly canceled. All available aircraft were redirected to strike the American invasion fleet at once. Before they could even take off, however, word came in that the entire seaplane flotilla at Tulagi had been obliterated. Minutes later, contact with Tulagi went dead, meaning the base had fallen. At 8:30 a.m., a formation of 27 twin-engine Mitsubishi Betty bombers roared into the sky from Rabaul. They were still armed with bombs instead of torpedoes, as they had been prepared for the New Guinea mission. Escorting them were 18 A-6 M0 fighters, climbing to 13,000 feet as they turned east over Buka Island, then south along the Bougainville coast. Just after 1 p.m., 4 USF-4F Wildcats from the USS Enterprise spotted the enemy formation near Florida Island diving from 18,000 feet. They attacked in a high-speed pass. Lieutenant VPDs shot down one bomber outright. 4 others began smoking and were listed as probables. But the Zeros pounced immediately, forcing the Wildcats to dive into cloud cover, as they had been trained to do. The encounter had cost the Americans dearly. One Wildcat went down in flames, and Lieutenant Dees's plane was so torn apart he had to make an emergency landing on the USS Wasp. Meanwhile, Lieutenant G.E. Fireball led another 6-plane flight from the Enterprise and caught the enemy formation off Santa Isabel Island. 10 Zeros swooped in, fast and deadly. Within moments, 3 Wildcats were destroyed. The remaining American pilots went for the bombers, and Ensign R.N. Dennis scored a kill, downing one Betty. The first Zero ever shot down in that engagement fell to radio electrician TWW Rhodes, who coolly fired into its belly before diving away. But the Zeros regrouped quickly and surged back into the fight, ready for more blood. The Zeros came roaring back in full force. 10 of them, flying in 2 disciplined formations, dove through the clouds after the retreating F-4Fs, following the strict Japanese combat code. Never lose sight of your wingman. They struck from the starboard quarter, their tracers slicing through the humid Pacific air. In the chaos, Lieutenant G.E. Fireball, along with enlisted pilot W.S. Stevenson Jr. and pilot machinist Shwe H. Warden, were shot down. Miraculously, a coast watcher stationed near Santa Isabel Island managed to pull Fireball from the water. Another watcher on Guadalcanal dispatched a canoe to rescue Warden, also off Santa Isabel. Stevenson, however, was never found. One more name lost to the sea. On the other U.S. carriers, the situation wasn't much different. Chaos above, heroism below. The Japanese bombers, though deadly, were larger and easier targets. 6 fighters from Flight 323 intercepted enemy aircraft near Lunga Point, shredding 4 bombers out of the sky. Machinist Darunin, flying solo, downed 2 Bettys by himself. Just after 2:30 in the afternoon, the Japanese formation, in a mix of Betty bombers and Zero fighters, began their deadly approach toward Guadalcanal. But this time, the coast watchers were ready. One of them, Paul Edward Mason, a former Copra planter turned Allied spy, sat perched atop Malab Hill on Bougainville at 9 a.m. He radioed out a chilling message. 24 Japanese bombers heading toward Guadalcanal. They were still 400 miles away, roughly 2.5 hours out, when the warning rippled through the network. From Pearl Harbor to the invasion fleet, it reached the ships with time to spare. On board the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra, the reaction was almost casual. The boatswain's mate piped the message across the deck. The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will dine at 11. And sure enough, at noon sharp, the torpedo bombers appeared over the horizon. The U.S. carrier fighters climbed to 20,000 feet, waiting in the sunlight above the incoming bombers. Below them, the fleet bristled with anti-aircraft guns, ready to unleash hell. When the Betty bombers reached the north shore of Guadalcanal, the entire invasion armada opened fire in unison. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese Air Force felt the weight of a coordinated American counterattack. The Wildcats tore through the bomber formation. 23 of the 24 Bettys were shot down. Only one limped away, smoking. The only American ship to take a direct hit was the destroyer Mugford, which absorbed a single bomb and stayed afloat. Against the Zero fighters, however, the story was different. Among the Japanese airmen was Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, already a legendary ace and one of Japan's deadliest pilots. 18 of the Empire's finest flyers had been handpicked for this long-range strike. When the F-4Fs pounced, they went straight for the bombers, ignoring the Zeros. That decision baffled Sakai. The American pilots seemed reckless. They dove in hard, made one pass, and if they missed, broke away fast. But it was no accident U.S. intelligence had briefed them thoroughly. The Zero was superior in turning and climbing but lacked armor. Engaging in a dogfight meant certain death. The Americans were adapting fast, hit hard, then vanish. In the swirling melee, Sakai shot down one F-4F and an SBD Dauntless dive bomber that had, incredibly, destroyed 4 Zeros on its own. Other Japanese pilots scored kills, though 1 Zero was lost. At one point, Sakai mistook a formation of SBD dive bombers for fighters and attacked head-on, straight into a wall of .30 caliber rear gunfire. His Zero was shredded, he was severely wounded, nearly blinded. Yet, through sheer willpower, Sakai managed to fly 560 miles back to Rabaul, land safely, and then collapsed unconscious in the cockpit. Even with the Zero's clear edge and maneuverability, the Americans were learning its weaknesses: fragile frame, limited firepower, and poor armor. The F-4F Wildcat, while slower and less agile, could take enormous punishment and still fight on. Control of the skies over the Solomons would now become a deadly tug of war. The U.S. carriers stationed close offshore had proximity on their side, but the Japanese had numbers. Their fighters were based at Rabaul, a staggering 1,100-mile round trip from Guadalcanal. Because of this, Commander Nakajima, head of the Zero unit, had refused to send every plane on day one. He deployed only his most experienced aces. But soon, even rookies would be thrown into the fight, and the losses would mount. By nightfall on the first day, the American foothold on Guadalcanal seemed firm. Over 11,000 Marines had landed. They'd reached the unfinished Japanese airstrip, soon to be named Henderson Field, and faced only light resistance. A captured prisoner told them there were merely 600 combat soldiers and 1,400 laborers on the island, most of whom had fled inland. Ammunition, food, and supplies piled up chaotically on the beaches. General Alexander Van de Grift, though uneasy about the overload, was relieved the carriers were still off the coast delivering cargo. At 8:40 a.m. on August 8th, Coast Watcher Jack Red reported another incoming wave: 45 Japanese dive bombers crossing the Bougainville Passage. The alert was relayed from Pearl Harbor to the fleet. The carrier squadron scrambled, intercepting many of the attackers before they reached the beaches. Still, some broke through. One blazing bomber slammed into the transport George F. Elliott, turning her decks into a firestorm. Another torpedo bomber struck the destroyer Jarvis, knocking her out of the fight. That same morning, aircraft from the USS Enterprise launched multiple sorties, bombing Japanese troop concentrations along the Tenaru River and strafing the half-finished airfield around 10 a.m. 3 Wildcats spotted another low-flying formation of torpedo bombers skimming the waves toward the invasion fleet. Machinist Darunin shot down 1 bomber, and a Zero escort Ensign VHH Rouse took out 2 twin-engine torpedo planes while Ensign J.D. Shoemaker bagged another. By day's end, the skies finally cleared. That night, Fighting Squadron 6 aboard the Enterprise counted its losses: 6 pilots gone. The Japanese still held the upper hand in aerial experience and aircraft performance, but the Americans were catching up fast. Post-battle analysis revealed the Zero's fatal flaws: limited firepower and a frame too light to endure sustained hits. The Wildcat, in contrast, could absorb incredible damage and stay airborne. Pilots were trained to fly in pairs, using a thatch weave, a scissors maneuver that forced attackers into the line of fire of their wingman. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Marines continued their brutal campaign. On Tulagi, they suffered 90 casualties but wiped out the 250-man Japanese garrison. Only 3 surrendered. The rest fought to the death or swam to Florida Island on Gavutu and Tanambogo. 250 Marines fell, while all 500 Japanese defenders were killed. The fierceness of those battles stood in stark contrast to the uneasy calm on Guadalcanal, where by the morning of August 8th, Marines casually reached the edge of Henderson Field. One young Marine, overconfident and weary, muttered to a reporter, "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight. All they do is run into the jungle." To the men, it felt almost too easy, but the officers knew better. Beneath that deceptive calm, something ominous was brewing. At sea, the American invasion fleet seemed unchallenged, at least for the moment. A few Japanese patrol boats, supply tenders, and transports were caught near the coast and swiftly destroyed in the opening hours through shellfire and bombing runs. But in the skies above, the Japanese were proving far more tenacious. Although many of their first bomber waves were wiped out, engaging the fast and deadly Zero fighters came at a price. 21 out of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier aircraft were lost. That figure, while not disastrous by operational standards, was enough to convince Fletcher that his instincts to withdraw were justified. At precisely 6 p.m., he radioed Admiral Gormley, requesting permission to pull back his carriers. Yet before a response could even arrive, Fletcher had already begun to turn away from the battle zone. When Admiral Turner intercepted Fletcher's message, the reality struck him like a blow. The withdrawal of the carriers meant the invasion fleet would soon be left with no air protection whatsoever. Worse, Japanese reinforcements and air power were expected to multiply rapidly, flying down through the chain of occupied islands. Meanwhile, the Japanese command was already in motion. The instant the Guadalcanal invasion alert reached Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa sprang into action. As commander of the 8th Fleet, the Outer South Seas Force, Mikawa oversaw Japan's entire South Pacific front. His first decision was swift: load 6 small transports with troops and send them south under destroyer escort to reinforce the 2,000-man garrison on Guadalcanal. However, fate intervened. The convoy stumbled straight into the path of the U.S. submarine S-38, operating out of Australia since the fall of the Philippines. The S-38 struck hard, torpedoing and sinking the transport Mayo Maru, taking 342 men with it. The disaster, coupled with fresh intelligence about the massive American invasion armada, convinced Admiral Mikawa that pushing forward now would be suicidal. He ordered the remaining transports to turn back. Yet naval reinforcements were already on their way. Early on August 7th, as the last Japanese defenders on Tulagi sent their final distress message, 5 heavy cruisers departed Kavieng on the northern tip of New Ireland. 3 steamed northeast toward Manus Island in the Admiralty Group. The other 2 turned toward Rabaul. By noon, Mikawa redirected all 5 cruisers toward Rabaul, assembling his strike force. Late that afternoon, the cruiser Chokai arrived in Simpson Harbor, escorted by a destroyer. The remaining ships, including the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari, waited in St. George's Channel for Mikawa's flagship to rejoin. When Mikawa finally came aboard, his fleet was ready. 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a single destroyer, all racing south toward Guadalcanal. As they sped through the darkness, Mikawa drafted his battle plan. By reducing speed, they could arrive after midnight, achieving the element of surprise. A night assault, he knew, would neutralize American carrier air power since U.S. forces had no night fighting experience. The Japanese Navy, on the other hand, had mastered nocturnal operations. Their crews drilled relentlessly in night torpedo tactics. For Mikawa, the challenge was one of timing. He needed to strike hard in support of Guadalcanal's defenders, yet not reveal his position too early. Unbeknownst to him, several critical flaws in the American command structure, divided responsibilities, poor air reconnaissance, and inefficient communication would soon work in his favor. American intelligence on Japanese ship movements depended largely on scattered air patrols and submarine reports. Coast watchers, invaluable for ground and air warnings, could do little to detect naval maneuvers. Earlier that day, US B-17 bombers from the Army Air Force had indeed sighted Japanese cruisers moving down toward Rabaul. That evening, the S-38 again sighted Mikawa's force exiting St. George's Channel and radioed the contact to Brisbane. Yet both reports were dismissed. Since Rabaul was now a major forward base, American commanders considered it routine traffic. No reason to assume an offensive was brewing. In theory, Admiral Gormley was tasked with coordinating all components of the Guadalcanal operation. In practice, however, his intelligence picture was fragmented. Long-range patrols were divided between General MacArthur's Army Air Force, including Australian squadrons, Admiral McCain's naval air units, and Fletcher's carrier-based aircraft, each operating with little communication. MacArthur's planes were ordered to patrol the Bismarck archipelago, focusing on Rabaul. Admiral McCain's patrols watched the Marshall Islands and Truk, while Fletcher's carrier planes, supposedly assigned short-range searches, conducted none at all, their crews preoccupied with the threat of Japanese counterattack. Admiral Turner, meanwhile, pored over his maps. The Japanese route of approach to Guadalcanal was dangerously obvious, a narrow waterway running south along the western coast of Bougainville, through the slot between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and then down between Florida Island and Guadalcanal's northern shore. This route would soon become infamous in naval history. On the morning of August 8th, Turner reviewed the day's search plan. Patrol bombers were scheduled to sweep the Bismarck's Santa Cruz Islands and Fiji Triangle. Yet one glaring gap remained. The slot itself, Turner immediately requested a special reconnaissance flight over the corridor. But somewhere between his flagship, Admiral McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane tender Mackinac at Espiritu Santo, the message was lost. That search never took place. Thus, on the eve of August 8th, as Admiral Mikawa's cruisers raced silently south, the Americans had left unguarded the most predictable path their enemy could possibly take. The shadowed, narrow sea lane soon to earn its grim title, the Slot.